Welcome everyone. Welcome to Code Reading Club. That's the session that you're in today. We are Katja and Felienne, and we will guide you through the session. And there was just this question already like, oh, should I have prepared something? So don't worry about it if you're just tuning in. We have a 30-minute talk before, and then the actual workshop part starts, and there's no need to prepare anything until we tell you to actually do some code reading. My name is Felienne. I will do the first part of the session. I'm also on Twitter, and my Twitter is just my first name, just @Felienne. So that's easy. If you want to mention something about this session on Twitter, feel free to do so and mention as well. As Katja said, I will take you also through the history a bit of code reading clubs, because you might wonder, like, why are those two people interested in code reading? What is code reading and what can we get out of this? So we have to go back to the year 2013. We're look a little bit back in time into my own personal history. Because in 2013, I started to teach programming to children, 10, 11, 12-year-olds in a programming club, and they were in need of a programming teacher. And I was like, sure, kids, I can teach you programming, no problem at all. Even though I didn't really know that much about teaching. I wasn't a professional teacher, but I thought, they're kids, right? They're 10-year-olds. How hard can it be? How difficult can their questions be? And then what happened was that sort of subconsciously, I started to think about my own experience in learning to program. So this is me when I was about 10 years old, learning programming at my dad's computer. So when I was learning programming, this was in the 90s, there wasn't really people to teach me programming. No one was teaching me programming, right? I learned programming from a book. I had a book, a paper physical book from the library, because there was no internet where I lived at that time. So I had this book, Basic Computer Games. And it's like, okay, I want to have games on my computer, and there aren't any games, and there wasn't Steam, so I couldn't download any games. So I'll just take this book and it will teach me how to make games. And if you open this book, this is what was in it. So it wasn't really teaching anything. Like, there wasn't any explanation. It was just like a picture of a pinball machine and then all of this. And as you probably hear from my pronunciation, I'm not English or American. I'm Dutch. And at that age, I didn't even know English. So stuff like next or apps, it had no meaning to me. I just copied everything into the computer, and then ultimately, well, it worked. And this culture, this, well, you'll just figure it out for yourself, is very much the culture of programming still today. Many people, of course, my age, children of the 80s, learned programming in that way, and inadvertently, we also teach programming in that same way. And even if you haven't received any traditional training in programming, this culture of, well, just figure it out for yourself is still very visible today. So what I will show you now is a few programming books for kids in which you can see that culture of exploration for yourself. The books are in Dutch, but there's an English translation underneath. So here, for example, it says, break the rules. Break the rules. So we're going to do a bit of programming, you just break some rules. Which is, of course, it's like a weird advice, right? Because there are syntax rules that you cannot break. So it's very much this, oh, just try out a bunch of things, break the rules, even though there are, of course, secret rules you can't break. And this is a book about Python. So if you know any Python, then you're probably aware that there are many rules you cannot break, like put a colon here and put a space there and put a quotation mark there. And most importantly, it's fun. So programming for kids, just, oh, try out some stuff and it will be just fun, right? It's fun to crack puzzles. So you see this culture of figuring stuff out for yourself, and then surprisingly, if there are people in the audience that have some experience with teaching, then surprisingly, it was really, really hard. The kids were struggling, and I was also struggling, because I was like, well, I turned on the computers and I gave you some books to learn programming. It has nice examples, so like, why aren't you learning anything? Reminder, I didn't know that much about teaching. And the interesting thing about the kids in the programming club is that they really made me want to understand learning to program. Because a 10-year-old that is confused will tell you. Like one of the kids in my club came to me after a club one day and he said, I'm never coming back to this stupid programming club. I was like, oh, ow, straight in the field. But if a kid that voluntarily comes to a community center on Saturday to learn programming isn't learning, then it's not the little kid's fault, it is the teacher's fault. So I got very, very interested in how do people learn anything? And one of the things I learned that's really life-changing is the Oxford Handbook of Reading that summarizes basically all the scientific research into reading natural language. So when I read this, I looked at the book, I read everything, I was like, wow, we don't really teach reading code. Compared to how much we teach reading language, why don't we explain kids how to read code? In a programming language, Scratch, that I use, many people might be familiar with it, which is a visual programming language. So you see blocks and the blocks control the program. So this kid in my club was like, yeah, I made this program last week. What does this do? And then I was like, what do you think it does, right? Exploring, break some rules, this will be fun. And never be afraid to mess around and experiment. But like, how would you even read this? This is a really hard question, especially the non-linearity of the program. Like, where do you even start reading? And as a kid, of course, like, I don't know, teacher. I asked you for help. And then what you say is, try some stuff. And if you compare it to how we teach language, both formally in school, but also informally, like to your own kids or kids that you babysit, if a kid says, hey, mommy, what does that word say? You're not going to say, what do you think it says? You'll break the problem into small pieces, right? You'll say, hey, do you recognize that first letter? It's the first letter of the ABC, of the alphabet. And people think, oh, and the next letter. So you help them, you give them strategies for reading. You don't just say, what do you think it says? It's not very useful. And this isn't just true for language. This is also true for many other out-of-school programs like music or sports. If your kid wants to learn the guitar, you're not going to give them the guitar and say, oh, just break some rules. This will be fun. You tell them like this is the C and this is the D, and if you don't know language, if you don't know music, then you'll get them a music teacher. And the same is true for sports. Also with sports, we don't say, oh, here's a tennis racket and some balls. You figure out the rules. So that was very, very visible to me that we don't really teach reading code. We don't give kids strategies to read code. This practice sort of continues into adulthood. If we are adult programmers, professional programmers, or even hobby programmers, we don't really practice code reading either, which is sad because research shows that professional programmers spend almost 60% of their time reading source code, or reading things, comprehending. So we spend more than half of our time on something that we did learn and we never practice. That doesn't sound like a good strategy. As a culture, I talk about culture all the time, but as a culture, we really assume that if you want to get better at programming, you should do more programming. This is something we celebrate. That, oh, if you want to get better at programming, you need this Saturday open source project, right? So you program all day, 9 to 5, and on the weekends, what you do to advance your craft is more programming, which is really, really, really weird. Again, imagine a famous guitar player, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen. Plays shows all day, plays shows all week, and then what does he do to get better? Goes home, plays a show. No, of course not. He just like scales, right? Deliberate practice on different parts of music, not just play a song. That's not how you get better. Same is true for sports. But this is really very much our culture. Try out stuff. Just don't be afraid to experiment. In December, you might be aware of this. In December, people often participate in Advent of Code, which is whole December period, every day you make a program. I mean, it's really fun. I like Advent of Code. But you see this focus on, if you want to get better, even in practice like Advent of Code that isn't realistic practice, the focus is still on code creation. Advancing, getting better at programming is writing more programs. So we don't teach and we don't practice reading. Third issue here is that we don't have theories for reading code. Like, what happens in your brain if you read code? I don't know. Nobody really knows. I mean, people are researching it, but it's definitely not an area that is so explored as reading natural language, or even reading math proofs, or doing other tasks. But luckily, we have this theory of what happens in your brain if you read natural language. And this theory can very much be used to contextualize what happens in your brain if you read code. As a quick reminder, or maybe an entire introduction into the basics of cognitive science, what happens in your brain if information comes in through your senses, usually your eyes, but other senses as well, is that the information enters your short-term memory. And your short-term memory is really small. We've known this since the 1950s by a researcher called George Miller. He researched that short-term memory is very small. It can only hold between 5 and 9 elements. And you might be aware of this work because often this is called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. One of the most famous papers in psychology. So he has shown that if you have to remember something, you can only remember a bunch of, like a handful of things. So let's explore it. Let's explore together how short or how small your short-term memory is. I'll show you a sentence very briefly, and you have to remember it. So it's just like half a second, so don't blink, because then you might have missed it. I'll show you a 3-word sentence, and it's your goal to remember the sentence. Here we go. So now you're like, wait, what? What was that? This is hard. This is unfair. This is unfair, Felienne. No one is able to do that. So let's look at the memory again, because clearly you're a functioning adult. I mean, you managed to log into this website, so I'm just gonna assume that you have a working understanding of reading English. How are you not able to remember a 3-word sentence? So what you have to know here is that information comes in through your short-term memory, which is very small, and then it is processed in your working memory, where thinking and thoughts occur. But your working memory doesn't work alone. It uses your long-term memory to support thinking about things. So even though the short-term memory is very tiny, your long-term memory, which is basically unlimited, everything you've ever seen and remembered is still in your long-term memory, supports your working memory. So let's try another 3-word sentence, and then you'll see the power of your long-term memory supporting your working memory. So here's a sentence. That was probably doable, right? It was still hard. Maybe you didn't get it, but at least you had the sense like, okay, this is tough but fair. This is something I could do. Here's another sentence, another 3-word sentence, and now I'm pretty sure that most of you will actually be able to remember this. So that was super easy, right? That was cat loves cake. And you were able to remember that in I don't know, half a second, maybe less. Because those things are retrieved from your long-term memory. So you're not going to do C-A-T, cat, U-O-V-S. You can just immediately recognize the letters, the word, and then the concept without any effort. And that without any effort actually is interesting. I want to point your attention to that. We say you can read this without any effort, but of course this isn't without any effort. How much time did you spend in elementary school learning the alphabet? How often did you practice the letter A? Hundreds, thousands of times. And after learning it, how many times did you practice? Like every day you see hundreds of letters A, of course. So it's not really without effort, but because you've practiced so much, and because before that you learned it extensively, this is why you now have all these things in your long-term memory that support your working memory. So it isn't just your short-term memory, right? It isn't even just that you're able to remember these words, you can also think about them. Maybe if you saw the sentence, you're like, oh, cat. Oh, I love cats. Oh, where's my cat? I haven't seen him in an hour. Oh, where is he? You can think that, right? You can think, you process the language while also remembering. That's not an issue for your working memory. So this just like the tip of the iceberg, but just a little bit to help you understand what happens in your brain if you read code. So I want to dive into that a little bit deeper before I give you to Katja and put your own brain really to work. Because I want to also look at 3 different forms in which programs can be confusing. So we just looked at 3 memory systems: long-term memory, short-term memory, and working memory. Each of those memory systems can be confused by programming, but they can be confused by programming in very, very different ways. And doing the type of exercises that we do at Code Club will help you to recognize different forms of confusion, different reasons why programming is hard, why reading programming is hard. So here's a program in a language called APL. You might have never heard of APL. It stands for A Programming Language. APL is a language that's basically based on vector calculus. So if I ask you to read this APL program and tell me what it does, what does this do? What is that T there? It's not a T, but what is that T-like thingy there? You don't know. You're confused by this. The issue here, of course, is in your long-term memory. It isn't that you're not able to remember this. Probably you can tell me that it's 22222TN. It's not hard to remember, not at all. But you don't know what the T is. So this is really a long-term memory issue. What you lack here is knowledge. You just don't know it. And you can ask me, what does it do? I can tell you it's called the encode, and then you might understand what it does. It is a lack of information. You just don't know the thing. Here's a Java program that can also be confusing, but different. So if you are a Java programmer, this will probably be easier for you because you will skip public and class and public static void main. You know that's just fluff. That's not important. So you read, okay, binary calculator. Oh, probably it's something with binary. Oh, there's an integer n. Oh, it converts an integer to a binary string. If you're a Java programmer, you can easily make sense of what is there. But if you're a Python programmer or an APL programmer or someone not so familiar with Java, this might present an issue in your short-term memory. If you don't know what is relevant, you want to remember everything. Public class, binary calculator, public static void main. You see, we easily go over the limit of things you can remember. And it's only like with the 3 sentences. Only if you're an expert programmer, experienced programmer, that you know what to read. If you're a beginner, then by the time you reach int n on the second line, and then I'm not even talking about the curlies and the brackets, then you might have filled up your short-term memory. So this is a short-term memory issue. Here's another program, a basic program. So here, the long-term memory also plays a role, right? Because I have to know what is let and what is for and what is print. The short-term memory also plays a role because I do have to remember all the lines. But here the working memory is what's specifically stressed. Because what is happening here? You might feel yourself tempted to pick your finger and start pointing at the screen. What is let n2? Okay, n2 is the absolute value of n. Okay, then b string is the empty string. Okay, now we go from n to 0. Oh, so we loop backwards. You have to do a lot of processing, and you might be tempted to try this with a value. Say, okay, let n be 7. Let's try and see what happens there. So this is code that specifically overloads, stresses your working memory. It isn't necessarily hard to understand. You know what syntax means. It isn't hard to remember either, but it's specifically hard to process. So if you are like, yes, but reading code is really hard, and I came here hoping you had a magic strategy. Well, yeah, that's true. Like reading language was hard when you were 6 or 7. but you can get better at it. You don't necessarily need to rewrite a code base. Like me and Katja talked about this extensively. And so often she told me that she is a professional programmer. I'm a professor. So I just know a little bit about professional software developer. But Katja told me that so often it happens that someone commits something to a code base and then someone else in the team comes into the code base and they're like, oh, this is structured in a weird way. Instead of putting in the effort to actually understand this, I'm just going to throw it away and rewrite it myself because that will be easier. And it's such a waste of time, but it's also a waste of team spirit. Because if I'm really proud of something and then I go back into the code base a week later and my stuff is gone and replaced by something else, and that's just not really good for morale, right? So rewriting is only easier if that's what you practice. So if for your entire life you only practice writing code, of course writing code is easier than reading code. But you can get better at reading code, just like you did advance in reading natural language as well. But it's not easy. Like, we don't have any free tricks that you can use. You have to put in the effort. And again, I want to remind you of this remembering of those 3 sentences, right? The first sentence was like, wow, this is impossible. And then the third sentence was very, very doable, only because you put in the work to practice a lot of reading. So that's the idea of code clubs, is that we practice reading so you will get better at it. And there are many, many techniques from reading that you can use. And one of the things that we very often do in Code Club is quickly gain an overview of code. In high school, if you have kids in high school, or if you remember your own high school days, like, how often did your English teacher say, here's a newspaper article and you can read it for 5 minutes and then you have to close your book and you have to tell me what it says in 10 lines. That is a really, really good technique to train yourself to find the highlights. Like, what is the goal of this code? What are the most important lines of this piece of code? Why is it made the way it is? What are the relevant concepts? So forcing yourself to write these code summaries is just one of the techniques that you can use. And today in the workshop, Katja is going to go into more and more of that. If you're interested in knowing more about the cognitive science behind reading code, then maybe you want to read my book as well, because I just wrote a book. It is already out as an early access program, so you can already buy it. It's called The Programmer's Brain. And what I more or less talked about in this brief talk is chapter 1, and there are 12 more chapters about what we know from cognitive science and how that can inform reading, code writing practices. So if that's something you're interested in, maybe you want to check out my book. Because this summary is just like one of the exercises in the book and one of the exercises we do in Code Reading Club. There are many, many other exercises out there. So that's my part of the workshop. So now I'm gonna give the floor to Katja. Maybe if there are a bunch of questions, we can briefly do a Q&A session. But then of course we're all eager to get going and explore code reading exercises ourselves. So I'm just gonna give you back to Katja, and she will introduce the exercises that we will do together.
Okay, hello. Thank you, Felienne. That was very interesting. I think you have to turn your microphone off though. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm now going to try and figure out how to share my screen, and then we'll talk about how we're going to get started. Let's see. I hope this will work. Right, these on the left, you'll see my slides, and on the right, you'll see an interactive Jamboard that we're going to use to hear each other's thoughts rather than just the chat, because it will be easier to organize on the output of the exercises. So what I'm going to do is run through basically the first workshop. If you were just starting a brand new code reading club, these would be the exercises and kind of the agenda that you would go through. So what I'm going to try and do is teach you how to run a workshop by experiencing what it's like to take part in a workshop. But because we don't have very much time, and because we've got 80 people in here, it's going to be very much like a flying visit through to what the different techniques are like, and hopefully you will get to experience some of the benefits of it as well. So on on this slide, there are links, and a lot of them are like weird long Google links. So that's why I haven't typed them up. But if you go to the runner.code-reading.org, you will get these slides, and then you can get these links. I'm also about to post them into the chat. I've left about 5 minutes for us to get ready to do this. And we've got a piece of sample code. So you're going to need to like write on that code. So you either need to print it out if you have a printer, or look at it on your screen, like on an iPad as a PDF and draw on top of it. Or you can look at it in the Google Doc that I've put here as well and copy the text out into some other way. So any way that you can think of to do it. And don't worry if you can't get organized in order to do that. I've got one that I prepared earlier that when we come to that stage, I'll be able to just show it and share it so you can see what it's like. But if you can at all, I would urge you to try to get a printout of this PDF. Is the very easiest thing to do. And the second easiest thing to do is sign up for this PDF annotation tool, which I'll show you how to use later. So I'm going to paste all these into the chat. Firstly, the code, if I can find everything. So try and get a copy of that you can write on in some way. And keep going. Nope. Oh, this one doesn't want to copy. And I'll set this up for another 5 minutes, so you have plenty of time to go and get this piece of code. Try not to look at it though. If you do print it out, turn it upside down, because you'll spoil the first exercise if you try and get ahead of yourself. So these that I'm going to put in, I've made 2 Jamboards. So if people can join the one, if your name starts with A to L, then the first one, and if it's M to Z, the second one, that gives people a chance to be able to see what they're doing. Oh, yeah, that's the right. And if people do have questions right now, if you type them into the chat, I can try and help. It's very difficult to multitask though. I see Rose had a question. Oh, Rose has a tip. Copy and put the code into a mural if you have an account. That's how they run code reading sessions at Neon Tribe. And this PDF annotation tool is very easy to sign up to. I think you just have to put in your email address and it sends you a magic link to go back to the board, and it's free. So that's also easy. Well, I'm assuming everyone's busy trying to get hold of that code or walked away from the session. No, there's still nearly 80 people here. It would be great if you all could give me a thumbs up that you're ready whenever you're ready, but we'll give everyone a good chance. I can see a lot of people joining the Jamboard. That's great. Ah, perfect, Felina. That's perfect. I mean, I really hope that we have enough space. If it turns out after the first exercise that everybody wants to participate in the Jamboards, then we can clone them and make a couple more. I sort of made them so that at least maybe 20 people would have a chance to put stuff on. And you can put Post-its on top of other people's Post-its, although it's a bit rude, but we can move them around when we have our conversations. Wow, there's 23 people in the A to L board and only 9 people in the other one. So yeah, if your board gets too crowded, just pretend you've got a different name. This is great. I'm assuming everything's working for everybody. And it looks like some of you are starting to be ready as well. So I'll just clarify, I don't think anyone's getting too confused, but we don't need to start posting on the Jamboards yet. That will be once we start doing the exercises. And it may be, I mean, I kind of was giving people enough time to run downstairs to their printer or next door to their office. But I think I'm going to flick onto my next slide to save time. And basically, this is all just explaining how this is going to work. So you're getting your code. I'm going to keep what I have on the screen now on the screen. So I will always have my slides with the timer, and I will always have one of the Jamboards showing, or I might have an annotated bit of code showing or something, but you'll be able to see that. So you can follow along even if you don't join in any of the boards yourself. And you should be writing on your code doc and into the Jamboard, whichever one you're on, while we go. And it's really important to remember that it does not matter at all what your level of experience is. There is nothing that is too basic to say out loud. And if you're reading the code and you're confused about something, it is just because you don't know what it means yet. And so there'll be all sorts of different people at this session, all sorts of different levels, and we all know something. So like Felienne said, you managed to get here into this hop-in session, so you must know something. And one thing to make very clear in your code reading clubs as well when you're running them is it's not a place for showing off. It's not about showing how clever you are, that you understood a piece of code more quickly or more comprehensively than anyone else. It's a place that you are practicing reading and to get perspectives of other people, and it will help you write better code by hearing how other people read code from their different perspectives. So hopefully we're all ready to get started, and I'm gonna just leave about 30 seconds in case anybody has any questions at this point before we start. So I can see some people getting excited. And no questions. Okay, well, we will get started then. So this is the first exercise, and there's no pressure, no code here at all. This is at the beginning of the session, we talk about why we're doing this. So now is the time to go onto the Jamboard and just write something that you're excited about this club, and something that you're worried about or confused about this club. And that's a really good way for you to, in your group, starting out your session, to find out just where everyone is, what kind of headspace everybody's in, and what people know and don't know. And so I'm going to now put my timer on for a minute, and everyone post into the Jamboards. Go, go, go. So Felienne, I'm on the one that Felienne is moderating. So let's see. Lots of them about learning new techniques, improving code reading, learning new things. Felienne, if you want to read out some of yours as well.
Absolutely. Someone is excited about using it in class. So I get someone who's a teacher. Someone says refreshing my skills, learning new things. Someone says I'm worried about not understanding the code or worried about not keeping up. Yeah, we understand. But again, as Katja said, don't worry. We're all here to learn. So even if you don't understand everything about the code, which can be a bit daunting, then there's still a lot smaller things you can learn.
Yeah, I've got similar. I've got someone thinking that their brain is getting too old. No, never. Practice. It's good for our brains. And worried about being the least experienced. No, same as Felienne said. Nothing to worry about at all. And these clubs will give you techniques to be able to. It really surprises me every time I run a club, how easy it is to understand the code if you go through it piece by piece. or just how possible it is even to get insights. I've noticed a few people joining with their video and microphones, which is brilliant. We've left a couple of extra slots in here so that people can do that. When we get a little bit further into the workshop, we'll probably call out things on the Jamboards that we would like to hear more about, and then invite that person to come on the stage, as it were, and talk about what their idea is. So we hope that that will work. It's going to be an experiment with this number of people. I forgot to press go on my stopwatch, but I'm assuming that we've had a minute now. So I'm going to move on, and that was really great. Now, what you need to do now as well is to advance your Jamboard onto the next, number 2. And this is the first glance exercise. Now, with this one, it is so important that you look at the code literally for like 10 seconds and then put it down. Oh, sorry, I skipped a section, which is what we just did, discussing what we were getting out of the club. And if you're doing an ongoing club in your workplace or wherever you do it, you will want to answer more questions like, who's going to facilitate each club? Do you want to take turns, or do you want the same person to do it? You need to think about how to accommodate different members of your club who are different levels of experience or different levels of confidence. And having that session that we just had, where people are talking about what their hopes and fears are for the club, is really going to help you be able to formulate what your club is about and what the goals of your club are. And it will make it much more likely that you will get something out of it when you do it. So now we're ready for our first code club exercise. This one is first glance, and it's really important, as I said, to just get your immediate reaction. So look at the code for 10 seconds and something will jump out at you. And I can see people are already starting to note those down. We also want to then turn it over again and look at it for a few more seconds and note down the second thing. So put that in the green box. So the first thing you notice and then the second thing you notice, and they can be really silly things, or they can be serious things about the whole piece of code, or they can be just this one single word that jumped out at you. And once you've had a chance to write down your first and second things that jumped out at you, try and reflect on that. Try and think about, why did those things jump out at you? Because that's often one of the very interesting insights that will help other people write better code when they hear. And our time's up for this. I said it would be quick. So while we're in the next section of discussing these, if you do have thoughts about why you think those things jumped out at you, then start populating the bottom of that. So this, we're going to go for 4 minutes. And we'll try and have a little bit detailed conversation. And this can be a chance for people to speak up if they would like to. Now, I don't know if it's going to work better if we just let people take up one of the slots, and when they appear, I can invite them to speak. Did anyone have anything interesting that jumped out at them and it surprised them? Why? A lot of people are noticing the regex. I'm not even looking at the code right now either, so it's too hard for me to look at everything. Is everyone too shy to come on stage? Mayara's saying that they missed it. Did they miss the talk or the code links? The code.
I can look them up and repaste them in the chat while you continue.
Okay. Well, if no one's coming on the stage, then I'm going to just read out some of these. So someone had some Java skills, which is why they thought it was easier to read. They recognize things from JavaScript and Python. So these are those kind of long-term memory things that Felienne was talking about. If you have done JavaScript or Java or Python before and you see similarities in the code, that will help you compared to somebody who never has. Prefer to read code with short lines. Need some code organization. Someone noticed about Brazil and US numbers. I should go over onto the other board as well and see. The curly braces and syntax looks familiar. So this is good. So we're all seeing like maybe this isn't a language that we've seen before, but a lot of it is similar to other languages. So that's a really good confidence boost to think, well, if I'm a JavaScript programmer, I'm never going to understand C, but maybe you will. You take it piece by piece and look at it and you'll see that some things are similar and some things aren't. Someone else was saying they noticed it because they were public and near the top of the file. So that's another thing. Sometimes you'll read from the top down. Some people read from the bottom up. In some programs, you have the return for the whole code at the very bottom. And so some people think, let me see what that is going to be first before I look at the top. And some people look at what are all the imports first. And some people look right into the middle to see if they can see an if statement or something. So we all approach it differently. And if you can start to think about the way that you approach it, then you'll get better at it and you'll get more understanding about how to quickly dive deep into a piece of brand new code. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds again, just to give people a chance to think about this. And also come on stage if you want to talk about it. Oh.
Maybe a little bit less saying if you don't want to come on stage, you can also type in the chat. That might be a lower threshold participation that is still very useful for us to get feedback. If I teach children, I always say, if I do it online, I'm like, please type something in the chat so I know you're not sleeping. So it's really nice for us to get feedback that you are participating, or maybe you are confused. So if you are a bit worried to share your video and your voice, we understand. But if you want to share, chat is also perfectly fine with us.
I'm also not worried. I have a feeling when we get a little bit further into the workshop, you're going to get so excited by something that you're just going to have to jump up on stage and say it. But Feliene's right. Of course, type into the chat. And I can see people typing into the Jamboards working really well. I hope everyone feels like they've got enough space to put their thoughts on there. So far looks good. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next exercise, which is about code structure. Now, it can be so scary to have a big new piece of code put in front of you for the first time. And you can look at it, and every single club that I go to, and I've been to dozens and dozens now, I look at the code on the first seconds of the club and I think, I am never going to be able to understand what this says. And by the end of the club, I can, from the help of my colleagues and from myself, just picking it apart piece by piece. So this code structure exercise that we're going to do is a really good way to just be able to dive in and do something proactive when you see a brand new piece of code. So this is the where we start our coloring. And I'm going to demo the code annotation on good annotations here. Hopefully some of you have downloaded it. And I'm just going to try and find my blank one. Right, this is the technique that I used to make that, which is that I took this highlight tool and I drew a bar that was about that big. So if you can follow along with me now if you want to, and other people, you might be getting your crayons out or something. I drew the bar, I made it kind of not very opaque. I took away the outline on the outside. And then I did copy, paste. So I did Control C, Control V, Control V, Control V, and I made a load of those blue bars. And then I just took one of the blue bars and I changed it to another color. And then I did copy, paste, 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 paste. And that's how you make those little bars. And then you can just drag them on to the bits of when you see a variable or you see a function, or you can draw them. And the way that this exercise will work is you want to highlight all the variables, all the classes, and all the functions. And then you highlight the place where they first get made. And then you draw a line to where it gets used. So it's like, where does it get declared or made or mentioned for the first time, and where does it then get used? And then you use, I use this little tool, the drawing tool, with the middle to draw the lines like that. There's also an arrow that you can use if you want to. So I'm gonna let people ask questions about how to annotate and let people get sorted with where they are. And then I will give you, I'm trying to check my notes for how much actual time I wanted to give you. I want to give you 5 minutes of your own time without me speaking to just look at the code and do that highlighting. So I'll set that up in about 30 seconds. I've got maybe a question. There's no way to do this that doesn't involve color. Oh, well, Chris, you can do different shapes. You could do a circle and a square, dashed lines and squiggly lines, underlines. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and set the timer now for 5 minutes because I think people have had a chance to get started. And I'm just going to be quiet. And I'll answer questions in the chat if they come. got just under a minute left. So hopefully people have had a chance to at least have a start. And in a normal code club, we would normally leave about 10 minutes for doing this. Okay. Now we're going to move on to having our conversation. And I've seen, Iwana had a question about, do we need the Miro app for this? No, you don't. You can just look at the Jamboard. It's helpful if you can see the code yourself as well. I have got the code here, so I'll leave this on the screen now for this next section when we start talking about it, so that you can refer to that and the Jamboard. But I'm just going to go back to my slide briefly so we can see what this section is about. You can also download the colored PDF if you want to. Let me see. Felina's put the uncolored one in there, and then this is the colored one if you want, with my beautiful drawings on it, which may or may not be accurate as well. I have to say, there's never a right and never a wrong. It's just about how we explore the code ourselves. So you don't want to get hung up in whether you're doing it right or not. So this is the part where we have our conversation, and I'm going to go ahead and give us, it says 6 minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and give us 5 minutes. Oh, I just gave us 6 minutes. Guess I'll give us 6 minutes. Try and think about, did you have trouble thinking about what was a variable and what was a function? Or do some of the patterns that you drew make you think that a certain part of the code is more important than others? And don't think about the big picture. You might be starting to understand what this code does or what it's about, or you might indeed have already understood the whole thing, depending on your level of experience. But don't think about the big picture right now. Just try and think about the pieces, and what we're trying to figure out is, how do we approach understanding code when we're reading it? And what is really interesting is also to hear how others approach, because I guarantee you that there will be many, many different approaches and experiences with this. So I'm going to be quiet again, and I'm going to let you start thinking about what you experienced, what thoughts you had, and what strategies you used when you were trying to pick apart those pieces. And write them out onto the Jamboard. And I'm going to put, you'll lose the timer if I put my code up, but I can flick back to it in a bit. I can see some brave people starting to write into the Jamboard. I'm still waiting for some brave people to come up on the stage as well. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to start reading out some of the things that I'm seeing on the Jamboard. So a lot of people are saying that they noticed the keywords func and let, and that presumably helped them identify where the functions were and where the variables were. People being confused about what is this 2E164? What's E164? Got confused between the variables and the types as well. Or even, I don't know, are there types? Are there variables? How the class is used. So how and then this one's quite, some of them, my screen's quite tiny. So difficult to read the longer one. So if you write a longer one, come on stage and share your thoughts with us. So looking over on the other Jamboard, someone else has mentioned that 2E164. Does anyone have any thoughts about why that might have stood out to people as being something they're unsure about? That E number? What's a raw value? What's a guard? Not sure how guards works. Oh, nice. Gary's saying probably comes from something imported, maybe. That's a very good reason to be confused about something when you're looking at a code snip. Because, of course, this code that we're looking at now is only one piece of a giant code base. So one of the things that happens in Code Reading Club is we always look at a standalone module or file, and you don't ever have any, or you shouldn't have any knowledge of the system that it's coming from, the bigger system. And that's what happens when you are at work and you're reading code. Also, you start by looking at one file at a time. So Hannah has a good point. It doesn't seem very descriptive because it uses numbers, not words. That's a very, very good point. And that kind of goes back to Feliene's talk as well, where she was showing us loads of symbols. And if you don't know, or the T symbol, if you don't know what that is, then it's easy to read plain English or whatever natural language you're used to. But it's not easy to read a load of symbols together unless that's the language that you're used to reading. So that might be a very good reason why it's jumped out. So we can see by I've lost my timer, but we can see by the level of activity that people were able to take part in this activity. And it looks like we're coming from a lot of different levels of experience and things, and you can get something. Brilliant. Time is up. So we're going to move on to the next exercise now. And just like the other ones, we'll start off independently and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. So we can advance our Jamboards on. This next one is to try and identify the most important lines. Now, this is super hard to do, especially the first time you do it. You're going to think it's impossible, but I promise you it works and it gets you to think about things in a different way. So what we want to do is try and identify the 4 lines that you consider to be the most important lines in this file. And then on the Jamboard, just write your list of line numbers, because that will help us be able to see when people have selected the same or similar ones. And then on the other side of the Jamboard, write why you chose it. So I'm going to put 4 minutes on the clock, and go ahead and just choose your 4 most important lines. And don't worry, they're all important, so you can't get this wrong. Even the curly braces are important. So Scout's asking, important for what? Well, that's open for your interpretation. So sometimes in the clubs, we do have a conversation about that, but it's often interesting to just see what important means to people. So important to you, and go for it. And don't cheat. Don't look at other people's lines. Is it lagging for anyone else? My internet can be a little bit suspicious, but it looks strong to me. So sorry, Renee. I'm going to put the code back up on my screen in case some people haven't got a copy of it. We've got about 2 minutes left. So really start to think about why you chose those lines as important and try and write those down. Time's up. I got carried away marking up the code. So I started trying to annotate different line numbers that lots of people have chosen. We're going to go ahead and move on to the discussion section. And I've got 6 minutes for this. So we'll go ahead and go. So now what happens in a club where you've got like 8 to 10 people is that you all get a chance to speak out loud and say what your experience was like when you were doing it. And what we try and do is let everyone have either 30 seconds or be able to say one sentence each. And then everyone just goes around the group saying one new thing. So if someone already said the thing that you noticed, say something else that you noticed instead, rather than getting stuck on one conversation about one thing. And what we do is we go down all the line numbers that everyone chose, which I don't have time to do with the number of people who are participating here now, but we go down on a shared document like this one, and we just put dots next to the lines, and you start to soon see some of them are very, very popular. And then you get other ones where only one person noted it as important. And then the interesting thing is to talk to the people about why they noted their line as important. And often you find that their reason is the same as your reason. It was just a different part of the code that they honed in on for that same purpose. So I'm going to try, and I really would love if somebody wants to speak, but I'm going to try and look at the reasons why people chose lines rather than get fixated on like counting the different lines. and hopefully that will start a conversation. So what happens is you're getting other people's perspectives, and this really helps you be able to write better code, because you're hearing how other people kind of comprehend and tackle pieces of code. So let's see if I can find some. Importing 5 and 6. I assume the rest of the code will be using this. So I'm going to go back onto my code. We've got 4 minutes, so we can just see the lines. So 5 and 6 are imports, and that's a very common thing that people feel is important, because we don't know what those are, and this whole file must depend on them. So that's an important thing to, if you imagine if you were someone, I think Scout at the beginning of this asked, what do you mean important for what, understanding or running? Well, important for if you're going to go and if you're looking at this file and you're going to try and fix a bug or add a new feature to it, what are the important things that you need to look at? Where do you think the problem areas might come from? What do you think is the core functionality of this code? Those sorts of thoughts. So knowing about the imports is a really good one. I want to know on a high level what this is and what it does. So I don't, because these comments aren't attached to the line numbers, it's difficult for me. It's difficult for me to draw any specific insights. So if you did have a really interesting insight and you would like to post into the chat your line number and your thought connected up together, then that would be good. Okay, so Scout's posting in that they would not have chosen the copyright. A few people did choose the copyright, and copyright can be an immensely important thing in certain contexts. And it can also be a thing that everyone ignores when they're writing code. So it's of course, as I said, like all of the lines are valid as important lines, even the copyright, and it can be the most important thing. Does somebody who chose the copyright want to say their reason why?
Hi.
Welcome. Hi, Scout.
I did actually choose that line, but I wouldn't have chosen it once you said important for fixing a bug or figuring out the code, because I think it's very important, because you don't want to copy something or use something that somebody has copyrighted. You can't put that in your code. So I did choose it, but I wouldn't have chosen it if the question would have been, is it important for like fixing a bug? Because for that, obviously it's not.
Yeah, but I didn't mean that was the only thing it could be important for. So it is important exactly for that reason. What you just said makes it a very, very important thing. If you're going to be using a library on a product that you're selling and you see that, and then it's extremely important, right? So I guess what I'm trying to show is that the context is very very important. I know I really didn't want to say the word important again. What do you want to share? What other lines you chose?
What other lines did I choose? I have to look at my notes.
Okay.
I chose 5. What was 5? I have to look at it.
Okay, 5 is import foundation.
They import things, and I assume those things that are imported are used, and the code wouldn't run without the imports. Although I didn't understand the code well enough to see if those imports actually were used in the code.
Fair enough.
I assume they were.
So does anyone else want to come in? I think we've only got about 30 seconds left, so we've got time to think about maybe one more thing, but I'm assuming that you all got something and you can understand why this exercise is valuable in a smaller group of people to have a conversation. Okay, time's up. So we will now move on to the next exercise, which is the summary. And in a code club, there are lots of other exercises as well that you can kind of mix and match up into a session. This is just a selection of like the very basic beginning ones. There are some exercises in our resources that I'll give you a link to at the end, which are much more advanced, where you visit the same piece of code for a second time, for a second group with the same people. But this exercise, because we didn't have the conversation about importance, it's maybe difficult for you if you haven't been able to concentrate enough or have enough experience to be able to read this code. So don't feel like you need to do the summary. By the time you've been through a code reading club with your group, you would be able to summarize something, even if you were a person who wasn't independently able to understand the code. But if you want to have a go, we've got 15 minutes left in the session, and I've just got a couple of other things to wrap up. So I'm going to put 3 minutes on the clock for this summary. And it'd be great at this point also if someone else does want to come on stage or type into the chat just any kind of insight that they had with the important lines, or starting to figure out summaries. If you have a question that somebody might be able to answer that's making you stuck because you think you might understand partly what it does, but you're not sure because of a certain thing, then that's useful as well. I'm going to remove my examples because they were deliberately misleading. And I'm going to be quiet as well because we'll have a chance to discuss this after. It was sort of unfair for me to include the summary exercise in this workshop, but it's often very cathartic in a real club. And it also often is that you run out of time before you get to the summary section because you've had so many interesting conversations before that actually the summary is almost irrelevant by the time you get to the end of the club. You've learned so many other things that are not really about we're practicing reading code and hearing how other people read code. We're not really trying to figure out what a piece of code does. So Scout's asking what we are trying to figure out then. Well, part of the fun of a session is figuring out what the code does for sure. But what we're trying to figure out is strategies that we use and understand, and strategies that other people use for reading a piece of unseen code. So a piece of code that you've never seen before, which happens to you in the workplace if you're a programmer all the time. What are your approaches for being able to read it? And the other thing that we're doing is practicing techniques for reading code so that when we do read code, we're more efficient about it. But we hadn't really got time to go into it in this session, but I know Felienne has a lot of research and thoughts around how to make us better programmers, essentially. So
if I can add to that a little bit, indeed, the main goal here is, and sadly we don't have time to reflect on that now, but think about what are the strategies that you're using here. And the same is true a bit for the previous exercise as well. How did you decide what is important? If you scan the code, what are the lines that your eyes linger on a little bit more? Because those are techniques that you can explicitly train and hone and make better. And that's the same here too. Like, how did you come to the summary? Why did you discard maybe some parts of the code? So the idea, of course, it's also fun to figure out what the code does, but the idea is really to train this technique and to reflect on what do I use if I have to summarize code.
Nice, thank you. So now in the club we have a discussion about what people thought it was about and our strategies about how we figured that out. So I'm going to go ahead and put those 4 minutes on for that and see if we can get people to talk about it. Now it looks like a lot of people honed in on the Brazil and the US. It looks like it's checking if an American or Brazilian phone number is valid, checks whether it's a US or Brazil phone number, not sure if it does anything else. I think the code defines what a valid country code is for 2 countries and then checks any given input for it if it's one of those countries. So it sounds like people are coming up with very similar summaries. Validates a given phone number based on a number pattern. Checks whether the phone number entered is a valid format for the 2 countries, US and Brazil. Validates numbers from specific countries. That's all right, Umar. Don't worry about it at all. If you want to come on, you can unmute yourself and speak. You're very welcome. Does anyone want to add at this point any observation that something that you figured out? I'm just going to shut my door for my dog barking. Any observation that you had about the functionality, anything that you were maybe a little bit uncertain about? Scout, yeah, it is terrifying. Accidentally unmuting yourself. It's no problem at all. So if you were a person who, oh, Anthony.
Yeah, I don't mind sharing my thoughts.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I guess I wrote in a previous slide about important lines. I thought like class name and the function name would be important because you get a high level idea of what it's actually for. And it's the class name tells you it's a phone number validator. And in the function name, where it tells you it is valid for a registration of some kind, and it returns a Boolean. So to me, I kind of knew already it's kind of Objective-C, but I'm not familiar with it. But I guess from a high level, I just wanted to understand, what it is and what it does. I'm not too worried about implementation details like the regex and all that. So for me, just looking at those main lines, 15, 18, and you can see that there's some logic happening on line 28, depending on the country, to validate, see if it's a valid country code or not for the given phone number, which gets passed in on line 18. I guess, that's just my thoughts. I just mainly looked at the highlights, which was the class name and method name for me, and that's what I focused on.
Thank you for sharing. Very brave. That brings up a really good point of naming, which is that big joke in programming that naming is always so hard, but it's super important. And if you can imagine, if this was written, if the class was called PN val and the function was called val for reg, it would be a lot harder to read, to understand, to a brand new person coming to this piece of code to understand what it was. So it's very important to kind of like write out your variable names a little bit thoughtfully, and change them when you realize that they aren't applicable. Or looking at code review, that's another really good thing that you can tell your colleagues. If you say, it's a little bit unclear what this variable does when I look at the name of it. And the other thing to remember is that when things change, sometimes you might keep an old variable name because you don't want to refactor through the whole code base, the variable name. And so quite often what happens in like a mature code base is something will start off as a phone number, and then later on it becomes contact information, which might be a phone number and might be an email, but it might still be called phone number in the code base, because in the end, the computer doesn't really care what it's called. So that's another thing to be really aware of, that Anthony's point sort of brings up, like another aspect of what we can think about when we're learning to read and write code. I don't want to go too much over time. We have another sort of 5 minutes little reflection session at the end of this. And at the end of your club with your colleagues and friends and whoever you end up running your clubs with, this is a really good thing to do to wind down, and also a good thing to remember at the beginning of your next session about especially things that didn't go so well, that didn't work well in the club, and things that did work well, to remember to do them again. And that is especially applicable also if you don't always have the same facilitator or the same group and things. So if we just take a little bit time now to like relax and reflect, maybe I'll put 2 minutes on, and Jamboard, post-it note up my Jamboard with your thoughts about good things that happened during this club, and kind of bad or things that weren't good that happened as well. And I'll be quiet so you can think. Oh, thank you. Someone jazzing up the Jamboard with backgrounds. I couldn't figure out a way to lock the background, and I thought it was too sad to have just a white background. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading out some of the things, unless people want to come and read them out themselves. Okay, there's a question about where we can find the code reading clubs. I've got one more slide at the end which shows, but if you, yeah, so I'll post it into the chat as well. I'm just going to go through a couple of these reflections while we can. Someone's still not 100% sure what the code does. Yeah, sorry about that. We didn't really have enough time to have a good conversation. And you can often get to the end of a code club and not be entirely sure what a piece of code does. And if your whole group gets to that point with a piece of code and you want to decide to then do the same code again in your next session, then that can be a really fun thing to do too. The code is from the Signal app. It's from the Signal messaging app, and it's written in Swift. And I thought that I posted a link, or I had it on my list of things to do, post a link of where the code comes from on this slide, but I don't think I did. But it's in our resources. This is like the starter code that we recommend people use because it's nice and short and its language is readable. A comment would be useful for what is E164. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. If you're not a phone person, you might not know. Complete eye opener, interesting exercise. Identifying the 4 important lines of code someone found good. We've got about 3 minutes left, so I don't want to run into the next person's workshop. So the Code Reading Club resources you can get through our website, which is code-reading.org. And that has links on it that go to our GitHub, which is a very rough and ready repository full of starter kits to help you run your first 3 clubs. You can also get in touch with me on my email address. Thank you, Rose. Rose just posted the link in the chat. It's very much a work in progress. We've been experimenting with it. We've been running clubs in a few different workplaces. normally with like 8 people, but a couple of workplaces had clubs with like 20 people. And we love getting feedback from people also. If you find some of the exercises difficult, easy, helpful, just let us know. I don't have Twitter. Felienne does. And I didn't put Felina's contact details on my slide because I think she had them on her slides. But you can, yeah, you're welcome to get in touch. And that you should be able to get in touch with both of us through the website also. So I'm gonna leave, we've got like 1 minute left. So questions and comments. CJ's asking about online clubs. We do all of our clubs online right now because we're in some form of lockdown. But we're thinking about doing, and we don't close them off to people deliberately. So it's CJ, if you do want to join a club, then get in touch with me and we can find one that you can join into. But also I'm thinking about doing like a public, maybe once a month club that people can just join into, maybe on Meetup or something. So if that is something you're interested in, get in touch with me and I will do something organized about it. So yeah, I guess that's us done.